Hey guys, Greg here, Final Rundown. Talking about jazz today. Who is this guy? Do you guys know who this is? George Coleman. We're going to talk about tenor saxophone great George Coleman that not enough people probably know about. And to be honest, I didn't know much about him till recently, till I got a hold of this new album that's coming out on Record Store Day, Black Friday, on Elemental Records and Reel to Reel Records, produced by Zev Feldman. And you guys may have seen I did an interview with Zev Feldman about a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and he has coming out with four records dropping on this Record Store Day. 3 of them are on Resonance, but this one is not on Resonance. This one is on Reel to Reel, which I believe is a Canadian label. Very similar to Resonance in terms of presentation. Nice photography, nice big booklet with a lot of interviews from a lot of people who had something to do with this record. But before I get into all about the record, I really want to talk about who is George Coleman. So let's do that. George Coleman. Okay, everybody knows and loves Miles Davis and knows that there was this first great quintet and a second great quintet, and John Coltrane, Wayne Shorter. What happened in the middle? What happened between John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter? Well, here's 3 records of the second great quintet, but George Coleman was the sax player on all 3 of these records. George Coleman actually did 5 records with Miles. I think only one of them was a studio record and the rest were live. But George Coleman was quite established as the sax player for Miles, at least for a brief period. So let's talk about that just a little. George is from Memphis and been played with a lot of people before he ended up with Miles. Played with B.B. King, Max Roach, and Max Roach's band included Kenny Dorham. So George sort of introduced himself to Miles, kind of a gutsy move, but probably 1957, 1958, Miles was playing at a club in New York called Cafe Bohemia, and George just kind of walked up to the band and said, "Can I sit in with you guys?" And to his surprise, they said yes. And Coltrane actually handed George his saxophone. So George sat in, played one tune on Coltrane's saxophone. Very nice guy that was, doing that for George. But must have made an impression on Miles, because a few years later, probably 4 or 5 years later, Miles found himself with a band that had sort of dissolved. The first quintet, everybody went their separate ways. Cannonball, Coltrane, Bill Evans, they embarked on solo careers. This is just a couple years after Kinda Blue. We're talking 63, 64. So George Coleman was the sax player with Miles for that period, 63, 64. And yet a lot of people just don't know that, and I have to confess I've seen his name on the covers and stuff, but didn't really come together in my mind that he was the saxophone player really for the first incarnation of the second great quintet, that being Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams on drums. And before Wayne was there, George Coleman was with that group. 5 albums. Let's take a quick look at these albums. I think this is the first one, not really a second quintet album per se, except for one tune. Gil Evans' Quiet Nights, kind of a Brazilian bossa nova, kind of maybe an attempt to get onto the Stan Getz bossa nova bandwagon. But that group does play on one tune, and it's the Gil Evans Larger Orchestra that plays on the rest of it. Miles Davis, 7 Steps to Heaven, and 1963, I guess, also. Herbie Hancock and Victor Feldman on piano. Frank Butler and Tony Williams on drums. 2 different sessions, a California and a New York session. 2 different groups, but beginning of the second great quintet right here. Okay, what else? And this is probably maybe the best known of those 3 albums. Funny Valentine, which is a live set. This is just the great second quintet, except before Wayne Shorter, there was George Coleman. And Wayne Shorter even has a big quote on here. So George Coleman today, kind of looks back, and he has mentioned, all these people doing this history of Miles Davis. He wasn't even mentioned. Well, he was there only probably less than 2 years, 63 and 64, but he deserves the accolades for being a player good enough when Miles Davis taps you on the shoulder and says, I want you to join my band, that means you are pretty darn good. That means you are at the peak of your craft. So, let's fast forward, how many years? Not even, what's 71 minus 63? Can you brilliant people do the math? 8 years? 8 years later, this recording was made in Baltimore. And I gotta confess, I'm not that familiar with the other musicians on here, but in Baltimore, there is a place called the Famous Ballroom, which is like a ballroom. It's not a jazz club. It's not a dark, smoky jazz club, but it's a ballroom where you can go see a concert on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday afternoon with your family and you know, pack a lunch and a Coca-Cola. Not a smoky bar. Kids are welcome. And this group called the Left Bank Jazz Society. Here's their logo, Left Bank Jazz Society. Kind of a non-profit cultural support organization that promoted jazz concerts for many decades in Baltimore. And so they're the ones behind this concert, and the venue happens to be called the Famous Ballroom. Today it is still there in Baltimore. Today it's known as the Charles Theater. But lots and lots of big-name musicians played there over the years, both with the Left Bank group and the Famous Ballroom. Lots of those were recorded. I've got ample notes here. I think someone made 800, yeah. Vernon Welsh and his buddy Benny Curse made 800 jazz recordings of the Famous Ballroom. Very few of them made it onto record, and apparently there have been rights disputes, and you just need the right producer to come along, somebody like a Zev Feldman, to come along and get those rights cleared and make everybody happy. You know, those artists may have been under contract with different labels at the time. So anyway, one of the few and very notable records to come out of that period, 1971, is George Coleman live in Baltimore. And this is a Francis Wolff picture. Francis Wolff, licensed from Mosaic Images, the very famous Michael Kuskuna, kind of the archivist or keeper of those great Blue Note era photos. Francis Wolff, great famous photographer, and his photography is all over. There's some other photos in here that are not him, but you can tell that this is all from the same photo session. Wearing the blue sweater. And did I mention George is still with us at 85? He turned 85 earlier this year. Still doing well. I don't know if he's playing much, but his health seems to be pretty good. There have been some interviews that haven't been fairly recent with him. So, still talking about George Coleman. After, and I'll get to that label. I'm jumping around. Had a lot of coffee. Sorry. So after that stint with Miles, so why would you leave the Miles Davis Quintet if that's the greatest band ever? George said there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure to do things that maybe he wasn't even comfortable doing. Miles was in poor health. Miles was in pain with this thing with his hip. And Miles would miss a lot of gigs and pressure George to do the gig without him. Starring Miles Davis Quintet, and there's George on stage without Miles. And George was not happy doing that. And George said people came up to him and said, Miles, you sounded great. Like, people would show up to see Miles Davis and not even know what Miles Davis played, trumpet versus sax. But he was just uncomfortable with that whole situation. The club owners were obviously putting a lot of pressure on people. Hey, the show must go on. Somebody's got to get up there and play. I sold the tickets, whatever. I'm expecting hundreds of people. So George was uncomfortable with that whole Miles Davis thing and left the band. And then Miles eventually grabbed Wayne Shorter, and of course everybody knows that period more famous, but George made a huge contribution to the music of Miles. So after George left Miles, he's made zillions of records, but I noticed that in 1965 he made 5 records with Chet Baker on the Prestige label. See if these names remind you of anything. Smokin' with the Chet Baker Quintet, Groovin', Comin' On, Cool Burnin', Boppin'. Where have you heard names like that on the Prestige label? So at that point, Chet Baker was trying to do a more jazz, hard bop, traditional kind of recordings, as opposed to the dreamy romantic where he's singing and crooning. So George was there for all of that. George was the sax player on Maiden Voyage, Herbie Hancock's one of his most famous records, 1965. That was like the whole second great quintet together with Freddie Hubbard instead of Miles on trumpet and George on sax. Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, Tony Williams. I got that record down here somewhere. Is this it? Oh yeah, here it is. Those lawyers work. It's just at my fingertips. There's my fancy copy on, Music Matters. My famous expensive copy. Maiden Voyage. George Coleman. Yeah. I'm making that up. All Herbie tunes. George is not really known as a composer. I don't know. I can't name any tunes he's composed. But certainly a very capable sideman. The tunes on this record are pretty much standards. Sandu by Clifford Brown, I Got Rhythm as Gershwin, Body and Soul, Joy Spring by Clifford Brown, which is probably my favorite tune on this. Just kind of a good live set, well mic'd, well recorded. Anyway, what was I going to say about George? I got more notes here. Why Did You Leave Miles, B.B. King, etc. Let me show you the booklet. All the stuff that Zev puts together, great booklet. So there's some photos sort of from the period which are not, famous photographer type photos, but sort of candids. So there's one of him at the Famous Ballroom. Oh, that's by John Fowler. John Fowler's the guy who kind of helped run the left bank thing for a long time. So we got an interview with producer Corey Reeds, article by Zev Feldman, article by Michael Kuskuna of Blue Note and Mosaic. Who else? George Coleman, in his own words, speaks with Corey Reeds. John Fowler speaking or interviewing. And Eric Alexander, a saxophone player. So, very much like the resonance type releases, Zev Feldman puts together a lot of great information, a lot of great history about the artist himself, about the recording session, about the challenges of putting the record together. And Zev Feldman, did I mention I interviewed Zev Feldman on this channel a couple weeks ago? You guys got to check that out. That's 50 minutes of all about Zev Feldman, Resonance Records, all the archival stuff he's put together. Zev is from the Baltimore area, or DC. The two are like very, very close to each other. Zev is from that area, and when he was younger, he attended a lot of concerts at the Famous Ballroom and with the Left Bank Society. And Zev is kind of taken it upon himself to help bring a little more notoriety to George Coleman. This album is almost an homage from Zev, a personal love letter, if you will, from Zev to George, and a great attempt to get George more well known to modern audiences. Oh, what I was going to say was, this album is from '71. George didn't even make any solo albums till '77, so this is kind of the first George Coleman solo album. Can you hear some saxophone? That's my son warming up on alto in the other room. I was going to play the George Coleman record, but I see that it's getting copyright hits from other channels, so I'm not going to do that. Universal Music Group, the Evil Empire, is going to demonetize this video if I do that. So anyway, George has made lots and lots of records, and this record coming out on Record Store Day is a very good representation of his playing abilities in just kind of a traditional sort of hard boppy, beboppy setting, and beautiful packaging, beautiful artwork by Zev Feldman, as you would expect. And yes, full disclosure, Zev did give me this as a thank you to the interview I did. Zev handed me a few records, which I appreciate very much. 90% of the people I've interviewed never offered a record. I've never asked for anything in return, other than I do this because I love the music, love promoting it, doing what I can to promote it. So guys, Record Store Day 2020, Black Friday, George Coleman Quintet, live in Baltimore from 1971 on Reel to Reel Records. And check it out. And subscribe if you like. Let me know what you think. And I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye. How do you turn this thing off? Hello.